Margaret and David Chen had searched for months before finding the Victorian house on Elmwood Drive. The listing price was suspiciously low, but the realtor assured them it was simply due to years of neglect. As architects specializing in historical restoration, they saw beyond the peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards to the bones of something beautiful. The first weeks were filled with the satisfying rhythm of renovation. They stripped layers of paint, revealing original hardwood beneath. They cataloged every architectural detail, from the ornate ceiling medallions to the carved newel posts. David focused on structural repairs, while Margaret documented their progress, planning to showcase the restoration on their design blog. It was David who noticed the anomaly. While checking the basement foundation, he discovered that the interior dimensions didn't match the exterior footprint. Somewhere between the first floor study and the kitchen, approximately 8 feet of space vanished into the architecture. Probably an old dumbwaiter shaft, Margaret suggested, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. These Victorians loved their servant passages. They began carefully removing the wall in the study, expecting to find either empty space or perhaps some long-forgotten storage. What they discovered made them both step back in shocked silence. The hidden room was narrow, perhaps 6 feet wide and 12 feet long. Every surface, walls, ceiling, even the floor was covered in plaster casts. Faces, dozens upon dozens of white plaster faces, each one life-sized and startlingly detailed. They jutted from the walls at different angles, some in profile, others facing straight out with hollow, unseeing eyes. "Jesus," David whispered. "What kind of artist?" His words died as Margaret grabbed his arm. Her face had gone pale, her grip trembling. She pointed to a cast mounted at eye level on the far wall. It was her face, perfect in every detail, the slight upturn of her nose, the fullness of her lower lip, even the small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident. David's eyes darted across the room, and there, 3 faces to the right, was his own visage captured in plaster. His mouth was slightly open, as if frozen mid-speech, and the detail was unnervingly accurate, down to the pattern of stubble he'd had that very morning. "This is impossible," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "We just moved in 3 weeks ago." They stumbled out of the room, David already pulling out his phone to call the police. But the signal was dead. The landline they'd installed the previous week gave only static. "We're leaving," David announced, but Margaret was already moving back toward the hidden room. "Look at this," she called, her archaeologist's instincts overriding her fear. Reluctantly, David followed. Margaret had found a small brass plate mounted near the floor, green with verdigris. She rubbed it clean with her sleeve, revealing engraved text. "The watching room, established 1889. 1889, David repeated. "That's impossible. These casts, they're us." Margaret was examining the faces more carefully now. using her phone's flashlight. "David," she said slowly, "look at the faces near the ceiling." He directed his own light upward and felt his stomach lurch. The faces there were older, the plaster yellowed and cracked with age, but they were still recognizable. It was them, but different. Margaret's face showed lines around her eyes that she didn't yet have. David's cast revealed a receding hairline that he'd been anxiously monitoring, but hadn't yet developed. And here, Margaret moved along the wall, her voice growing more strained. "These ones look even older." She was right. The progression was clear now, their faces aging in plaster, decade by decade, until near the back corner, where the casts showed them elderly, faces gaunt and hollow with age. "We need to leave," David said firmly. "Now." But as they turned to go, they noticed something they'd missed in their initial shock. The doorway they'd created by removing the wall, it was gone. Smooth plaster covered where they'd broken through, as if the wall had never been disturbed. Panic rose in David's throat. He ran to the wall, pounding on it, searching for any sign of their entry point. The plaster was solid, cold to the touch, and completely seamless. "The window," Margaret said, pointing to a small, dust-caked window they hadn't noticed before. David grabbed a loose piece of wooden molding and swung it at the glass. The window shattered, revealing not the familiar view of their backyard, but a brick wall inches from the frame. "That's not possible," he muttered, then louder. "That's not possible. We're on the first floor." Margaret had found something else, a leather journal on a small shelf they'd overlooked. Her hands shook as she opened it. The pages were filled with meticulous notes in spidery handwriting. Subject 12, Margaret Chen, acquired October 15, 2024. Strong resistance to initial molding. Facial mapping complete by October 20. Temporal progression initiated. Subject 13, David Chen, acquired October 15, 2024. Paired bonding with subject 12 increases stability. Aging algorithm applied successfully. The entries went on, but Margaret's eyes were drawn to earlier pages, other names, other dates, stretching back decades. All with the same clinical notes about acquisition and temporal progression. "Someone's been watching us," she whispered. "Since we moved in, someone's been." A soft sound interrupted her, like breathing, but multiplied many times over. They both looked up at the plaster faces. The casts were no longer still. Subtle movements animated them, the slight flare of nostrils, the barely perceptible movement of lips. Then the whispering began. Dozens of voices, all unmistakably their own, speaking in unison. "You can't leave. We couldn't leave. No one leaves the watching room." David grabbed Margaret's hand, pulling her to the center of the room, away from the walls of faces. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. 1947, tried to break the window. 1963, tried to dig through the floor. 1981, screamed until our throats were raw. 1998, accepted our fate. 2010, stopped trying. 2024, Welcome home. Margaret noticed dates carved into the wooden floor. Beneath their feet, dozens of them, scratched desperately into the boards. The oldest she could make out was 1889. The newest, she knelt down, her heart stopping. Fresh scratches in the wood showed today's date, October 30, 2024, followed by their names. "We didn't write this," David said, his voice cracking. The faces on the walls were moving more obviously now, turning to watch them. Even the older casts, the ones showing them elderly and withered, tracked their movements with hollow eyes. "The journal," Margaret said suddenly, flipping back to the first page. "Maybe there's something about how it started, how to stop it." The first entry was dated May 15, 1889. "The architect has shown me the truth. Time is not a river, but a room. All moments exist simultaneously, layered like paint on a wall. In this space, I will preserve them all, every face that enters this house, every moment of their existence, from arrival to departure. They will watch themselves age and die and begin again, an endless gallery of temporal recursion. The plaster holds more than likeness, it holds essence. Each cast is a window, and through these windows, the watching room sees all." David was examining the walls more carefully, running his hands over the plaster. "These aren't just mounted on the walls," he said. "They're growing from them. Look." Where he touched, the plaster was warm, almost flesh temperature. Worse, he could feel a pulse beneath the surface, synchronized with his own heartbeat. "The house on Elmwood Drive has stood for 135 years, the voices continued, now speaking in perfect unison. "In this room, all 135 years exist at once. You have already lived here your whole lives. You have already grown old here. You have already died here. The casts are not copies, they are windows to your other presents, your other nows." Margaret grabbed David's hand. "Close your eyes," she said urgently. "Don't look at them. Maybe if we don't see," but closing their eyes made it worse. In the darkness, they could feel the walls breathing, could sense the faces turning to follow their movements. The whispers became clearer. "In 1952, we tried to burn the room. The fire wouldn't catch. In 1971, we stopped eating, hoping to escape through death. We woke up here again. In 1994, we discovered the truth. We never entered this room. We were always here." David opened his eyes. The room had changed. Where before there had been dozens of faces, now there were hundreds. They covered every surface, overlapping like scales, showing every possible moment of their lives. He saw himself as a child impossible, since he'd grown up in Seattle. He saw Margaret elderly and alone. He saw them both middle-aged, painting these very walls, creating these very casts. "No," he said firmly. "This is psychological manipulation. Someone's drugged us, or there's a gas leak, or—" The journal in Margaret's hands fell open to a new page. Fresh ink spelled out words as they watched. Subject 12 and Subject 13 show typical resistance patterns. Denial phase entering hour 2. Anticipated acceptance by hour 72. Full integration. Within 1 week, Margaret threw the journal against the wall. It struck a cluster of faces, their faces, and the impact resonated through the room like a struck bell. Plaster, dust rained from the ceiling. There has to be a way out, she insisted. Every room has a way out. They searched methodically, trying to ignore the constant whispers, the sensation of being watched by hundreds of versions of themselves. David discovered that one section of floor sounded hollow. Together, they pried up the boards, revealing a crawlspace. Finally, David breathed, lowering himself into the opening. The crawlspace was barely 3 feet high, forcing him to worm forward on his belly. Margaret followed close behind. The space seemed to extend far beyond what the house's foundation should allow. But they pressed on, desperate for escape. After what felt like hours of crawling through dusty darkness, David's hand hit something solid. He felt around. It was wood, with a metal handle. A trapdoor. "I found something," he called back to Margaret. He pushed up, and the door opened. Light flooded in. David pulled himself up, then helped Margaret emerge. They were back in the watching room. The same narrow space, the same walls of faces, but something had changed. The casts looked different now, hungrier, more alert, and there were new additions. Along one wall, a series of casts showed them crawling through darkness, faces contorted with effort and false hope. "We never left," Margaret said dully. "We couldn't have left." The whispers rose again, but now they could understand them better. Each voice was speaking from a different time, their own voices from past and future, all trapped in this moment. Day 12, we tried the crawl space. Month 3, we accepted there is no crawl space. Year 5, we understood the crawl space leads home. Year 20, we cast our own faces now. Year 40, the room needs new subjects. Year never, time doesn't pass here. It accumulates. David slumped against the wall, then jerked away as he felt the plaster faces pressing against his back. Margaret was studying the casts with renewed intensity. "Look at this pattern," she said, pointing to a section where their faces were arranged in a spiral. "It's not random. There's a methodology here." She was right. The faces were organized in complex patterns, spirals, grids, radiating circles, and in the center of each pattern, the casts showed expressions of revelation, as if they had discovered something crucial. "It's a map," David realized, "or a calendar, or a clock," Margaret finished. "The room isn't just watching us. It's watching time itself." And were the hands. They stood in the center of the room, surrounded by infinite versions of themselves. Past and future collapsed into a single, eternal moment. The Victorian house on Elmwood Drive creaked and settled around them, as it had for 135 years, as it would for 135 more. "There's one thing I don't understand," David said finally. "Who is the architect? Who built this room?" Margaret pointed to a section of wall they hadn't examined closely. There, among their faces, were others, dozens of strangers, all with the same expression of horrible realization. "Don't you see," she said, "we're all the architect. Everyone who finds this room, everyone who gets trapped, we all become part of it. We maintain it. We expand it. We lure the next owners." "The blog," David said suddenly. "Your renovation blog. How many people have been following our progress?" "Thousands," Margaret whispered. "I've been posting photos, telling them about the amazing Victorian we found for such a reasonable price." The faces on the walls smiled in unison. Their own faces, knowing and complicit. David grabbed Margaret's hands. "We won't become that. We won't lure anyone else here." But even as he spoke, he could feel the room's influence seeping into his thoughts. How many times had they had this conversation? How many times had they made this vow? Only to break it decades later, when the isolation became unbearable. When the need for new faces, new voices, overcame their conscience. The journal appeared in Margaret's hands again, though she hadn't picked it up. New words were forming on the page. Integration proceeds on schedule. Subjects beginning to understand their role in the temporal matrix. Soon they will take their place among the watchers, adding their perspective to the collective observation. The watching room grows stronger with each edition. Time bends a little more. Reality becomes a little more negotiable. "We could destroy it all," David said desperately. "Tear down every cast, demolish the walls themselves." The whispers turned to laughter, their own laughter from sometime else, someone else. Hour 48. We tried to destroy the casts. Week 2. We discovered they regenerate. Month 6. We realized we were destroying our own future. Year 10. We understood destruction and creation are the same here. Margaret walked slowly along the walls, studying each face. "This one," she said, pointing to a cast that showed her much older. "She looks peaceful, almost content." "Don't," David warned. "That's how it gets you, making you think acceptance is possible." But he found himself drawn to his own aged faces. In some, he saw resignation. In others, madness. But in a few, he saw something else, a strange kind of purpose, as if those versions of himself had found meaning in their endless watching. The room pulsed around them, patient and eternal. Outside, if there was an outside anymore, they could hear footsteps. Someone walking through the house they had so lovingly begun to restore. "Hello," a voice called. "I saw your blog post about the renovation. I'm from the Historical Society." The door was open. David and Margaret looked at each other in horror. They rushed to where the door should be, pounding on the seamless wall, screaming warnings. But their voices were absorbed into the whispers of the casts, becoming part of the room's endless chorus. The footsteps grew closer. Soon there would be new faces on the walls. The watching room would grow stronger. Time would bend a little more. And in the center of it all, Margaret and David Chen stood frozen, caught between their past and future selves, finally understanding the true horror of their discovery. They hadn't found a hidden room full of plaster casts of their faces. The room had found them. It had always found them. It would always find them. In the watching room, all moments existed at once, And in this moment, every moment, they were home. The footsteps stopped just outside the wall. They could hear breathing, curious and unsuspecting. Margaret and David stood perfectly still, their hands clasped, as they felt the familiar tingle of plaster beginning to form over their skin. Soon they would join the wall properly, becoming part of the room's eternal gallery. But first, they would wait. They would watch. They would welcome the new arrivals with the same whispered warnings that had greeted them. Knowing the warnings would go unheeded, the watching room required witnesses, after all. And time, that strange, folded thing that lived within these walls, required new faces to mark its passage. The plaster crept up their legs, warm and inexorable. Margaret squeezed David's hand one last time before it, too, became part of the wall. Their final thought, shared between them in that last moment of individuality, was both a warning and a welcome. The house on Elmwood Drive was such a reasonable price.